In March of 1943, records from the 8th Air Force's operational diary mentioned something unusual. A new fighter had arrived at Boxted Airfield in Essex. Pilots gathered around it in silence. Some laughed, others just stared. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt weighed 7 tons fully loaded. That was twice the weight of a Spitfire. It looked like someone had strapped wings to a milk truck. Ground crews nicknamed it the Jug because its fuselage resembled a moonshine jar. No one believed it could fight. But within 6 months, that heavy, awkward machine would climb higher and faster than any German fighter in the sky. What happened in those months changed the air war over Europe. This is the story of how weight became an advantage, how physics saved lives, and how a plane everyone doubted became the backbone of Allied air superiority. This was the day the rules of dogfighting were rewritten by engineers who understood something the rest of the world had missed. When the first P-47s rolled off the assembly line in Farmingdale, New York, in late 1942, Republic Aviation knew they had built something different. The design came from Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian immigrant who believed in one principle above all else: power over elegance. Kartveli had fled Russia during the revolution. He carried with him a deep understanding of machinery and a practical mind that valued function over form. He arrived in America in 1927. By the late 1930s, he was chief engineer at Republic. When the Army Air Corps asked for a new fighter in 1940, Kartveli studied the war in Europe carefully. He saw Spitfires and Hurricanes fighting at 20,000 feet. He read reports of combat over France and Poland. He noticed something others had missed. The battles were moving higher. Bombers were climbing to escape flak. Fighters had to follow. But most engines lost power as the air thinned. Kartveli decided to solve that problem first. Everything else would follow from that solution. The Thunderbolt was built around the largest engine available, the Pratt and Whitney R-2800 double wasp. That engine produced over 2,000 horsepower at sea level. It had 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows. It was a monster, but raw power was only part of the answer. To maintain that power at high altitude, Kartveli designed a turbo supercharger system that sat in the rear fuselage. Exhaust gases from the engine spun a turbine. That turbine drove a compressor. The compressor forced thin, high-altitude air back into the engine at sea-level density. It was brilliant. But it was also complicated. Ducting ran from the engine all the way back to the tail and then forward again to the carburetor. The system added 1,200 pounds to the airframe. It required intercoolers to prevent the compressed air from overheating. It needed regulators and wastegates. Mechanics hated it at first. There were more things to break, more systems to maintain. But Kartveli knew what he was doing. That supercharger would give the P-47 something no other fighter had. It would give it strength where the enemy was weakest. The prototype flew for the first time in May 1941. Test pilot Lowry Brabham took it up from Farmington. The plane climbed like nothing he had ever flown. At 30,000 feet, it was still accelerating. Republic engineers watched from the ground with binoculars and slide rules. The numbers matched their predictions. The Army was impressed. Orders were placed. By late 1942, production was ramping up. But there was a problem no one had anticipated. The plane was heavy, really heavy. Empty, it weighed almost 10,000 pounds. With fuel, ammunition, and a pilot, it topped 14,000 pounds. Compare that to a Spitfire Mark V, which weighed just over 6,000 pounds loaded. The P-47 was more than twice as heavy. In the air, that weight had consequences. At low altitude, the plane was sluggish. It took time to accelerate. Turning radius was wide. Roll rate was slower than German fighters. On paper, it looked like a disaster. Fighter pilots in 1943 believed in agility. They wanted tight turns and quick rolls. The P-47 offered neither. So when the first operational squadrons received their Thunderbolts in early 1943, the reaction was not enthusiasm. It was doubt. Lieutenant Robert Johnson arrived at Boxted in April. He had trained in lighter planes back in the States. He expected something nimble, something responsive. When he saw the Thunderbolt for the first time, his heart sank. In his memoir, published years later, he wrote about that first impression with brutal honesty. "It looked like a bathtub with wings," he said. "I thought someone in Washington had made a terrible mistake." The cockpit sat high on the fuselage. Visibility was excellent, but the nose stretched forward like the snout of a hog. The landing gear was stiff and narrow. Taxiing felt like riding a tractor across a plowed field. On the ground, the P-47 was clumsy and loud. The big radial engine shook the whole plane. Mechanics had to hand crank the inertial starter. It took 2 men and a lot of effort. Everything about the Thunderbolt felt excessive. Johnson's first flight did not reassure him. The plane took forever to accelerate down the runway. It needed every foot of Boxted strip to rotate. Lifting off felt sluggish. Climbing away from the field, Johnson tried a few gentle turns. The controls were heavy. The ailerons required real force to move. At 5,000 feet, he tried a tighter turn. The plane wallowed. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 could outturn it easily. So could a Focke-Wulf 190. Johnson landed that day convinced he was flying a death trap. He wasn't alone. Across the 8th Air Force, pilots complained. Some requested transfers to P-38 Lightning squadrons. Others wrote letters home expressing worry. Morale in the P-47 units was low. The British, flying their elegant Spitfires from nearby bases, were polite but skeptical. Royal Air Force pilots had been fighting since 1940. They knew what worked. The Spitfire was proven. It was nimble and fast and beloved. The Thunderbolt seemed like an American mistake, born of industrial excess and a poor understanding of air combat. Even some American commanders had doubts. There were quiet discussions about canceling P-47 deployments and focusing on the P-38 instead. The spring of 1943 was a dark time for the Thunderbolt's reputation. Pilots didn't trust it. Mechanics grumbled about its complexity. And the Luftwaffe was waiting across the channel, confident and experienced. The German fighters had been fighting for years. Their pilots knew the sky over Europe like farmers know their fields. They had tactics refined through hard experience. They had shot down hundreds of Allied planes. Now they were about to meet the jug, and nobody on either side expected what would happen next. But then something unexpected occurred. In late April, a squadron from the 56th Fighter Group encountered German fighters near the Dutch coast. The mission had been routine. Escort a formation of B-17 bombers to a target in the Ruhr Valley. Stay close. Watch for bandits. The bombers were at 26,000 feet. The P-47 circled above them at 28,000. It was cold up there. Ice formed on canopies. Pilots breathed oxygen through rubber masks. Then the call came, over the radio. Bandits, 10 o'clock high. Messerschmitt Bf-109Gs were diving out of the sun. There were 8 of them. They had altitude advantage. The Luftwaffe pilots saw the Thunderbolts and attacked with confidence. They had fought Spitfires and P-38s before. They knew how to bait a heavy fighter into a climb, bleed its speed, and then pounce from above. It was a standard tactic, but when the 109s began their dive, the P-47 pilots did something no one anticipated. They didn't turn. They didn't try to dogfight. They climbed, not slowly, not laboriously. They climbed like rockets. The superchargers were operating in their sweet spot. The big radial engines were gulping compressed air and turning it into raw thrust. At 28,000 feet, a Bf-109's Daimler-Benz engine was struggling. Its single-stage supercharger could not maintain pressure. Power dropped by nearly 40%. But the P-47's turbo supercharger was just hitting its stride. The Thunderbolts climbed at over 3,000 feet per minute. Within seconds, they were 1,000 feet higher than they had been. The Messerschmitts tried to follow. Their engines choked. Propellers clawed at thin air. The 109 pilots felt their planes shudder and slow. Meanwhile, the P-47s kept climbing. They reached 32,000 feet, then 35,000. The German fighters couldn't follow. They had no choice but to level off and try to escape. But now the Americans had the advantage. The P-47 pilots leveled off, rolled inverted, and came down in screaming dives. Gravity and weight worked together. The Thunderbolts accelerated past 400 miles per hour, then 450, then 500. No 109 could match that speed in a dive without risking the wings tearing off. 2 Messerschmitts were caught in the first pass. Both went down trailing smoke. The rest scattered and fled east. The entire engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. When the American pilots landed back at their base, they were buzzing with adrenaline and disbelief. They gathered in the briefing room and replayed the fight over and over. One pilot, Captain Hub Zemke, stood at the front and listened. Zemke was the commanding officer of the 56th. He was a quiet man, thoughtful and precise. He had been skeptical of the P-47 too, but now he saw something. He saw possibility. That night, he sat down with his flight leaders and talked through what had happened. They realized that everything they had been taught about dogfighting was wrong for this plane. The Thunderbolt wasn't built to turn with a 109. It was built to dominate the high-altitude environment. Its weight, its size, its complexity, all of it made sense at 30,000 feet. Down low, it was clumsy. Up high, it was king. Zemke issued new orders. No more low-altitude dogfights. Stay high. Use the climb rate. Use the dive speed. Fight the battle on your terms, not theirs. Over the next few weeks, those tactics spread through the 8th Air Force. Pilots began to trust the machine, and the kill ratios started to shift. Weight, in the right conditions, was not a curse. It was a weapon. At high altitude, the P-47's mass gave it momentum. In a dive, it accelerated faster than any fighter in the European theater. Pilots started calling it diving to safety. If a German plane got on your tail at high altitude, you didn't try to turn. You pushed the stick forward and went vertical. The nose dropped. The altimeter unwound. 500 miles per hour. 550. The controls stiffened. The airframe groaned. But it held together. Republic had overbuilt everything. The wings could take 9 Gs. The engine could handle the stress. Meanwhile, the German pilot behind you faced a terrible choice. Follow and risk structural failure, or break off and lose the kill. Most chose to break off. The Thunderbolt's diving speed became legendary. By summer, Luftwaffe intelligence reports warned their pilots about it. One captured document, now held in the National Archives in Maryland, describes the P-47 as the high-altitude danger and advises pilots to avoid extended combat above 8,000 meters. But the Thunderbolt's real advantage was something quieter, something that didn't show up in combat reports right away. It was endurance. That big engine, for all its power, was remarkably efficient at cruise settings. The internal fuel tanks held 305 gallons. Later models carried even more. With external drop tanks, a P-47 could fly over 800 miles and still have fuel for combat. That range, combined with high-altitude performance, made it the perfect guardian for the daylight bombing campaign. In early 1943, American bombers were being slaughtered. Without fighter escort deep into Germany, they faced flak and swarms of Luftwaffe interceptors. Losses were unsustainable. The P-38 Lightning had range, but it struggled at high altitude in the cold European climate. Its Allison engines were unreliable in freezing temperatures. The P-51 Mustang was still in development. That left the P-47, and by mid-1943, the 8th Air Force realized what they had. The Thunderbolt wasn't a mistake. It was exactly what the war needed. The Luftwaffe noticed, too. German fighter pilots began changing their tactics. Reports from Luftwaffe units in France and the Low Countries described new standing orders. Avoid prolonged engagements above 7,000 meters when facing Thunderbolts. Instead, try to lure them down into the thicker air below 5,000 meters. Down there, the P-47's weight became a disadvantage again. A Focke-Wulf 190 could outturn it. A 109 could outclimb it at lower altitudes where the supercharger advantage disappeared. Sometimes the tactic worked. In turning fights near the deck, the P-47 struggled, but American pilots learned quickly. They stopped chasing. They stopped taking the bait. They stayed high, circling the bombers like patient guardians. If the Germans wanted to attack the B-17s, they had to climb into the Thunderbolt's realm. And up there, the jug ruled. By the end of 1943, P-47 squadrons were claiming more kills than any other Allied fighter in the European theater. The plane that looked like a bathtub had become a predator. More importantly, bomber losses started to drop. Crews looked up and saw those big radial engines circling above. It gave them hope. It gave them a chance. There was another quality the P-47 possessed, one that saved more lives than any gun or speed advantage. It was tough. The radial engine could absorb damage that would destroy an inline engine. A Merlin or a Daimler-Benz had liquid cooling. One puncture in the radiator, and the engine overheated in minutes, but the R-2800 was air-cooled. Bullets could punch through cylinders, sever fuel lines, shatter accessories, and the engine would keep running on the remaining cylinders. There are documented cases of P-47s returning to base with half the cylinders destroyed. The airframe was overbuilt. Wings were thick and strong, with multiple spars. The cockpit had armor plating behind the seat, under the seat, and in front of the engine. Republic had designed the plane not just to fight, but to bring pilots home. They understood that a dead pilot was a waste of training and experience. A pilot who survived could fly again tomorrow. That philosophy was built into every rivet. Robert Johnson learned this firsthand on June 26, 1943. The mission was an escort run to an aircraft factory near Paris. Johnson was flying as wingman in a flight of 4. The bombers hit their target and turned for home. On the way back, near the coast, Johnson's flight was bounced by Focke-Wulf 190s. The attack came out of nowhere. Johnson broke hard, but a 190 got on his tail. Cannon shells walked up his fuselage. The first rounds hit the engine. The cowling shredded. Then the cockpit exploded. The canopy shattered. Glass and metal fragments tore through the interior. Johnson felt a sharp pain in his right shoulder, then his leg. Blood soaked his flight suit. His instrument panel was destroyed. Half the gauges were gone. He could barely see through the broken canopy. The 190 made another pass. More rounds hit. The right wing was holed. The tail was ripped. Johnson's plane shook violently. He thought about bailing out, but he was over-occupied France. Bailing out meant capture or worse, so he kept flying. The engine was still running. Impossibly, it was still running. 3 cylinders were destroyed. Oil streamed back over the windscreen, but the remaining cylinders kept firing. Johnson pushed the throttle forward. The plane responded. He pointed the nose toward England and flew. Every mile was agony. His vision blurred from blood loss. The controls felt mushy. He couldn't tell if the flaps or landing gear would work, but the P-47 kept flying. It crossed the channel. The white cliffs of Dover appeared through the haze. Johnson radioed his base. He said he was coming in hot, possibly no gear. The tower cleared the field. He came in fast and flat. At the last second, he yanked the gear lever. The wheels came down. The plane hit hard, bounced, and rolled to a stop. Rescue crews ran to the aircraft. They pulled Johnson out. He was covered in blood. Medics rushed him to the infirmary. He survived. Later, after he was patched up, Johnson went out to look at his plane. Ground crews had counted the damage. Over 200 bullet and cannon holes. The fuselage looked like a sieve. One mechanic stood there shaking his head. He said quietly, "No plane should be able to fly like that." But the P-47 could, and did. Stories like Johnson's spread quickly through the squadrons. Pilots began to trust the machine in a way they hadn't before. It wasn't just that it could fight. It could take punishment and bring you home. There were dozens of similar stories. Pilots landing with engines on fire, with control surfaces shot away, with fuel tanks holed. The Thunderbolt absorbed it all. Mechanics developed a deep respect for the plane. They worked long hours in cold hangars, keeping them airworthy. They learned the quirks of the turbo supercharger system. They learned how to patch holes and replace cylinders. They learned that the P-47 rewarded care and attention. It wasn't an easy plane to maintain, but it was loyal, and in war, loyalty mattered more than elegance. By late 1943, the Thunderbolt had earned its place. Pilots requested assignment to P-47 units. The waiting lists grew. The plane's reputation had transformed completely. By early 1944, the P-47 had become the workhorse of the 8th and 9th Air Forces. Over 3,000 were in service in Europe alone. They flew bomber escort, ground attack, and air superiority missions. New variants appeared. The P-47D had a bubble canopy for better visibility. Later models had water injection for extra boost at takeoff. Armament improved. 8 50 caliber machine guns became standard. Each gun carried hundreds of rounds. When all 8 fired together, the recoil slowed the plane noticeably. Pilots called it the hammer. Ground attack versions carried rockets and bombs. They went after locomotives, bridges, and supply columns. The Thunderbolt proved versatile. It could do anything the mission required. But its primary role remained unchanged. It was a guardian of the bombers. It was the fighter that made daylight strategic bombing possible. The true measure of its success wasn't in the number of kills or missions flown. It was in something quieter. It was in the letters pilots sent home, letters that spoke of confidence and safety. It was in the faces of bomber crews who looked up and saw those big, heavy fighters circling above them at 30,000 feet. The silhouette was unmistakable. The sound of those radial engines was unmistakable. It meant protection. It meant someone was watching. For young men sitting in freezing bomber turrets surrounded by flak and enemy fighters, that meant everything. The P-47 had done what no one thought possible. It had turned a disadvantage into dominance. The weight that made it clumsy on the ground made it unstoppable at altitude. The complexity that made mechanics grumble gave it endurance and power where it mattered most. Alexander Kartveli had built a plane for the conditions of war, not for the fantasy of elegance. And in doing so, he had saved thousands of lives. The P-47 Thunderbolt flew over 500,000 sorties during the Second World War. It destroyed more than 7,000 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. It brought home more damaged planes than any other fighter in the American arsenal. Pilots who flew it in 1943 and 44 often said the same thing in later years. They said it wasn't the fastest plane or the prettiest, but it was the one that brought them home. In the cold mathematics of war, that was the only number that truly mattered: survival. The Thunderbolt taught the air forces of the world a lesson that still holds today. Performance is not about one number or one quality. It is not about speed alone or turning radius alone. It is about understanding the mission completely and designing for the conditions where the fight will actually happen. The P-47 was built for high altitude. It was built for long range. It was built for punishment and survival. It was built for the war it had to fight. And in that role, it became unbeatable. There is a photograph in the National Archives that captures something essential. It shows a line of P-47s at an English airfield in the winter of 1944. Snow dusts their wings. Propellers are still. The ground crews are nowhere in sight. It is early morning. The light is gray and soft. The planes look heavy and solid. They look like they belong to the earth, not the sky. But anyone who flew them knew different. Up high, where the air was thin and cold, where the sun was bright and the sky was endless, those heavy machines became something else. They became swift and deadly and dependable. They became what their pilots needed them to be. Many of us still remember seeing photographs like that, one in old Life magazines or in newsreels at the cinema. There is something honest about the Thunderbolt's shape. It never pretended to be graceful. It never apologized for what it was. It just did its job. The pilots who flew it understood that. They stopped asking for elegance and started asking for one thing: a plane that would fight beside them and bring them home. The P-47 did that better than any other machine of its time. It carried them through flak and fire. It climbed above the enemy. It dove to safety. It absorbed damage that should have been fatal, and at the end of the day, it brought them back to English soil, back to their crews, back to another chance at life. If this story moved you, share your thoughts below. Your memories and reflections keep history alive for those who come after us. We are building a quiet corner for those who value the lessons of the past, for those who understand that every machine tells a human story. Join us by subscribing. In a busy world full of noise and hurry, thank you for taking a few calm minutes to remember. Thank you for honoring those who flew and those who built and those who waited at home. Their whispers still matter. This was one whisper from the Second World War. Thank you for listening.